Again, welcome to this webinar on the safe and sustainable by design concept. Today we will be hearing from my ChemSec colleague Henrik Edin. He's a policy advisor with deep knowledge in the area discussed today. We will also get a company perspective by Dr. Maria Åkerfeldt, Chemical Safety and Regulatory Affairs Specialist at the H&M Group. And we will be recording this session and we'll make that available afterwards along with the PowerPoint presentations. And please note down any questions you have to the panelists in the Q&A in Zoom, and we will have some time at the end to address this. So ChemSec is an environmental NGO aiming to reduce the use of hazardous substances by collaborating with companies, highlighting positive examples, showing what's possible. We get our funding from governments and foundations to remain independent. We also provide a number of online tools, such as the SIN list of chemicals for phase out. And with that, I would like to hand over to Henrik.
Thank you, Teresa. I am going to make a short update on the safe and sustainable by design topic, what is happening in the EU, and also the ChemSec position on safe and sustainable by design. ChemSec, as some of you might know, have been following and working on this topic since the launch of the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability in October 2020. Where it was first proposed that safe and sustainable by design criteria for chemicals should be developed. We can take the next slide. But I would just like to start off by presenting the process and some central and relevant elements to it. First of all, there is now a series of stakeholder workshops being conducted by the Commission. In it, a lot of voices are being heard from different actors. ChemSec is part of it. Some other large industry organization is also active in it. The last workshop was held in March, and the next will be held this autumn. There is also a high-level roundtable that later in May will discuss the safe and sustainable by design topic. It is composed of leaders from different organizations, and they will give their input on a lot of different topics within the chemical strategy, but this May they will talk about safe and sustainable by design. There is also the GRC, the Joint Research Center Expert Group, that recently published a report, or rather a framework for assessing chemicals safety and sustainability. And this framework is basically the bottom line of discussions right now, and a very important piece in this process. The final initiative is deemed to be adopted late 2022, possibly as a Commission working document. We can take the next. Yes, thank you. I would also like to touch upon the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability and highlight some quotes from the strategy that gives us the possibility to discern the ambition of this initiative, why it is needed, and what should be done. So, as you can see, substitution of most harmful substances has not occurred at the expected pace, and frontrunners still encounter major economic and technical barriers. And it is particularly important to incentivize industry to prioritize innovation for substituting, as far as possible, substances of concern. And new chemicals and materials must be inherently safe and sustainable from production to end of life. We can take the next slide. So this is the bottom line. And when we read the chemical strategy at ChemSec, we started thinking, what can we do to make this more tangible, more concrete and productive? What can be our addition? So we came up with 3 core guidelines or principles for the process of finding a final safe and sustainable by design criteria. First, safe should always mean safe. Second, safe and sustainable by design criteria should drive substitution. And third, implement it now and do it stepwise. And I will go through them one by one to give a little bit more information on what we mean by that. Next slide, please. First step, safe should always mean safe. It's quite self-explanatory, but not evident. We need to call things what they are. So we cannot call a substance that causes cancer, we cannot call that safe, period. And so this is, bottom line, this is about the protection of human health and our environment. And we need to recognize it. But it also about trust in the market and also in decision making, in our decision makers and the policies they pursue. So, and we have this health argument, but we also have economic arguments. For example, we know that a lot of the recycling industry is struggling with hazardous chemicals in their production chains, and that the loss of revenue amounts to billions of euros. So we have really strong incentives, both for our health, but also for our economy, to phase out hazardous substances. So we need to mean it when we say it, that safe should mean safe. We can take the next slide. Safe and sustainable by design should also be a driver for substitution. So we propose a sort of labeling system where we can rank different chemicals in accordance with safety and sustainability parameters. And please note here that we do not propose a minimum requirement. We propose something that companies can strive towards. So it's really a system for creating incentives, as in line with the chemical strategy from the quotation you saw earlier. And this is something that, of course, would push industry in the right direction, away from hazardous chemicals. And maybe the most important part is that it would actually benefit companies that are at the forefront, pushing the boundaries for what is possible in chemical management. Next slide, please. And we think there is no time to lose. We can implement it now. Already today, we have a lot of data about safety and sustainability that we could apply. And even in the cases where there aren't enough data, we can still set a deadline, a timeline for when we want this data to be compiled and published. So, for example, if we start with carbon emissions, maybe we want to include other things along the way, like waste and water use in production. We can take the next slide. So these are the core guidelines or principles that ChemSec has been pushing for. And now, just a couple of weeks ago, the GRC Expert Group presented this framework for safe and sustainable by design. It's in the shape of a 5-step model for assessing the safety and sustainability of chemicals. And I'll just go through it briefly. The first step is a hazard-based approach with a cutoff criterion, where the intrinsic properties of the chemicals, as was said in the chemical strategy as well, are tested. And if you don't reach a certain level, the assessment will stop. The chemical is simply not deemed to be safe and sustainable by design. So there's a cutoff criteria, there's a hazard-based approach in the first step, and that's something we very much welcome. The second step, it's a risk-based approach, and it's looking at the production phase of the chemical, the safety of that. The third step is a risk-based approach for use, the exposure of chemicals in the use phase is being done there. And the fourth step, there is a life cycle assessment of sustainability. And then in the fifth and final step, there is an assessment of social and economic sustainability. However, this is not a mandatory part for the overall assessment. It seems, as it stands now, that this will be this is somewhat voluntary, and perhaps it will lessen the complexity of the model a bit. Perhaps that might be good. So we can go to the next slide. So conclusions from this. The GRC Expert Group model holds great potential. We see that there are a lot of things in there that's great, especially the hazard approach to begin with, and recognizing that not all chemicals can be safe and sustainable by design. But there are still many, many unknowns, things we don't know. And this is why we are having this webinar as well, because we feel like there's a great opportunity for front-running companies to leave a mark on the process. And I would very much encourage everyone listening, if you feel like this is something that would benefit you, you should actually engage in this process, because it's very, this is the time to do it. Because ultimately, a framework with safe and sustainable by design would benefit, or should benefit, the companies that are actually pushing the boundaries, trying to phase out hazardous chemicals. So if you feel like you're one of those, yeah, you should definitely engage. We can take the next slide. And yeah, so that's the end of my short presentation. I will, thank you for your attention. And I leave the floor to Maria from H&M Group to tell us about their work with safe and sustainable by design. Thank you.
Thank you, Henrik, and thank you, Chemsec, for inviting H&M Group to this discussion. We're very happy to be here to share our point of view on the safe and sustainable by design framework. From now on, I will be using the abbreviation SSBD, just so you can follow when I do that. Next slide, please. Starting with a brief presentation of our company leading up to our chemical vision, which you can see here. The H&M Group's vision for sustainability is to lead the change towards circular and climate positive fashion while being a fair and equal company. Our ambitious sustainability strategy is at the core of our business, and it was produced jointly with external and internal experts. It spans the entire value chain, focusing both on our own operations and, together with other stakeholders, the industry in general. So building on this sustainability strategy and our work there, our chemical vision is to lead the change towards a toxic-free fashion future, meaning that, one, we identify ourselves as leaders, as wanting to be leaders and frontrunners here, wanting to be considered in that way. And two, that we want the direction for chemical management to be toxic-free. Next slide, please. Now, before anyone points out that water is also toxic if consumed in high doses, I'd like to share a definition of what toxic-free entails to us. Well, we define toxic-free as the combination of traceability and safe chemicals. Traceability includes things such as knowledge about our supply chains, where and which chemicals that come in, the processes and materials used to produce our articles, chemical risks associated with those. And with all of that, of course, also having the relevant tools in place to collect and analyze data, as well as to monitor performance. And safe chemicals, on the other hand, to us means inherently safe chemicals, i.e. complete avoidance of chemicals with the worst adverse effects on human health and the environment. So we are talking about carcinogenic, mutagenic, reprotoxic, endocrine disruptors, persistent bioaccumulative toxic, persistent mobile toxic, etc., etc. Please, next slide. And just want to delve a bit deeper into the aspect of safe chemicals. Now, we as a company have worked for a long time to restrict these bad substances, the worst substances, by the use of chemical restrictions. And these are negative lists, so lists saying what we can't have in our products or in our production. And we have adopted common industry standard for these, but we also have on top of that class approach restrictions, for example, PFAS, biocidal treatments of textiles, etc. But the question now is, how will chemical restrictions and these kinds of negative lists work in a future, potentially and hopefully circular economy? Well, it won't be enough to secure something as safe in terms of, for example, risk and exposure potential using only today's knowledge, or only looking at the first life cycle, or even a stage of a life cycle as we do today. We need to consider all upcoming life cycles. We need to consider all upcoming product and chemical regulations too, and also upcoming hazard classifications, as these will affect also the chemical regulations, of course. So I was just going to say something about substitution there as well, so that we change the slide. And all of this is especially true in the substitution of chemicals we today know are the worst. So we really want to avoid the pitfall called regrettable substitution. And our main challenge to do this today is the lack of information about chemicals. Now let's move to the next slide. So why is it so? Why are we lacking this information? Well, we're a retail company, so our main influence is as a downstream user placing articles on the market. We have set a proactive chemical management roadmap, and again, we do consider ourselves to be a front-runner company in downstream chemical management. We believe that many others, our peers and the networks we work in, see ourselves as front-runner company in this aspect. But a big challenge for us are very complex supply chains. There's no clear line back to the chemical components for us today. It's very difficult to get across that hurdle of lack of transparent information. At the same time, we see that our customers increasingly expect more chemical information about both products and about factory workers' health and safety as well. So, and again, the product regulatory initiatives that will require more information from us. So that's where the SSBD comes in. And I know this was a long introduction to come to the SSBD concept, but this is to really frame how important this concept and this framework is for us. This means to us an opportunity to enable transparent communication, both upstream and downstream. So both to the chemical industry about what our requirements are on our products, but also from them about what the chemical products they supply our suppliers with actually contains, and then also towards our customers about what product and work and factory workers' health and safety. So that's what we're talking about here. Next slide, please. So moving on to the actual SSBD framework and our comments on it. Being a global company, we're very happy to see that the SSBD framework and criteria sets out to become a global reference for safety and sustainability targets, and that it aims to enable safe and sound substitution practices, starting fundamentally with design guiding principles. So the pre-market approach is definitely here, and we like that a lot. But then moving on to the actual framework, we see that there are at least 3 points in the SSBD framework that would need clarification or revision for the SSB to reach the hallmark status that we really think that it in itself aspires to have, and that we wanted to have and we needed to have. As you can see, their hierarchical approach, the stepwise implementation, and the full scorecard across supply chains. And I will just now tell you a bit more about each and every one of them. Next slide, please. So we're very happy to see the hierarchical approach proposed in the framework, and especially that safety comes first. And to assure the safety of SSBD stamped labeled chemicals and materials, not just in one lifetime, but hopefully many, we believe it's pivotal to start with inherent hazards and to truly rule out the worst substances. Now we see that hazard assessment using CLP comes first, but we believe that the framework should clearly set the direction for the future, and especially for us as downstream use as well. So what we're saying is that not everything today, not all chemicals and materials need to be considered or qualify as SSBD today. The important thing is that we have this as a direction. And with that reasoning, we strongly question how come even SVHC, substances of very high concern, could be considered SSBD given that essential use is included in the cutoff criteria. Now that's very weird. So we definitely believe that essential use should not be part of the cutoff criteria. We also believe that all CMR and endocrine disruptors should be part of that, of course. Another aspect connected to the hazard assessment is that we lack a lot of information about how mixtures will be hazard assessed. And this is very important to us because we mainly, our suppliers mainly use mixtures. That's what they do. So, and we think it remains unclear whether it will be like CLP mixture classification rules that will apply or whether it will be a substance by substance approach. Again, we would like to say that with the stricter product legislation that is coming for our articles, we would appreciate if it was more of a substance by substance approach in the framework, because that way we could probably assure our articles' future legal compliance by choosing SSBD chemicals. And there needs to be some way of a red line for us to, you know, how do we go about making sure that our products are compliant moving forward. Next slide, please. So connected to this is also, just as ChemSec, we also would favor a stepwise implementation, stepwise introduction and implementation of the proposed criteria. Oh, I moved to the next one. That it should be similar to the hierarchical approach, so starting with the intrinsic hazard, the occupational health and safety, and the use phase safety. And then move on to look at environmental sustainability criteria. We also see an issue right now with the proposed criteria, the environmental sustainability criteria, which seems to be based on environmental LCA approach, which we think is biting off a bit too much at once. It would be better to start by looking at where there's also data enough to actually come to conclusions, etc. So we believe that it's better to start with criteria where there is sufficient data and where the needs from downstream users are the greatest. Next slide, please. And this is about communication. So what the framework says is also that there will be some kind of score and probably even a scorecard, but it's not what we would like to make sure here and try to advocate for at least, is that the scorecard becomes something that is made available across supply chains, not only the chemical supply chain as such, but also to downstream uses, chemical and article manufacturing. And this, of course, very important if the framework is to become a global reference, because everything is not just within the EU, as we know. So rather than only communicating the final SSBD score, we believe that a full scorecard, separate scores for the different stages down to substance level would be very useful for us as downstream users. And we also know that data gaps are a serious problem that could potentially undermine parts of the assessment or the full assessment. And for that reason, we also want the proposed data quality score to also be included as, for example, an extra column in the full evaluation scorecard. Next slide, please. So to summarize our main points again, safety first, stepwise implementation, transparent communication across supply chains regarding all steps and data quality. I'd just like to conclude by congratulating the GRC to a really good proposal that just needs some minor tweaks to really become the global reference for safety and sustainability targets that we as downstream users of chemicals placing articles on the market urgently and desperately need. Thank you so much for listening. I think there's a last slide there if you want to.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was very clarifying, always very interesting to get the company perspective. We see that there are a few questions that already have been posted in the Q&A, and we have a few minutes to answer some of them. Something that I see has come up, we answered it briefly, but maybe we could highlight something about the economic aspect Is this something beyond the scope of the current framework or less important than safety? How does this process handle the economic aspect? Do you have any comment on that? Maybe Henrik?
Well, it's very clear if we go through the 5-step model that the GRC framework presents, that the social and economic sustainability aspects is the last thing you assess. The first thing you assess are the intrinsic hazards of chemicals, and then risks posed in the production in the use phase. So it is not it's not necessary for the final safe and sustainability assessment either. So we don't. I mean, it's not a mandatory part of it. But by all means, it's not. This is a process that is ongoing. I think the GRC framework put down some really good, starting points. There are still some things to be decided on, but for a start, the GRC framework is a really good base.
Great, thank you. Then we have a question here. Can you elaborate a bit more on the hazard cutoff criterion? I don't know if Maria, if you would like to start or leave it to Henrik immediately.
Well, about the background of the hazard criteria, the way it was proposed in the framework, the last framework, we're expecting a new one too, but was like a division into 3 different categories. So whereas the first one, S1, would be where the cutoff criteria would apply. And in there, they have included like the worst, I would say, like the worst of the worst, the SVHC, for example, but they also provide this derogation for essential use, which I think is alarming. There's also only like CMR substances classified as category 1, not category 2, et cetera, et cetera. So there are definitely things that we feel from our side could be made more stringent there. Mm-hmm. It needs to be made more stringent if this is truly to become the hallmark, if it's truly to become something to aspire to, it needs to be more stringent there.
Great, thanks. Another interesting question that I've heard before as well is that how does the Safe Sustainable by Design deal with the use of harmful chemicals that don't end up in the final product? Henrik, could you maybe talk a bit about that?
Well, I think it's it is the final product that is being assessed. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that this framework is a way to, or this labeling system, if it is created, is a way to have the market forces by themselves push in a certain direction. It's not necessarily connected with the regulation, that this is being prohibited or this is removed from the market. It's rather that there's a really clear marking on what chemicals are preferred. And then market actors can act on that, like H&M Group would obviously use this. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that there will still be hazardous chemicals on the market. And they will still be sold and will still be used, but they cannot be labeled safe and sustainable if they're not safe. So it's really, I think that's one of the greatest misconceptions of this debate or this process, is that if chemicals are not deemed safe and sustainable by design, they will not be sold anymore. Because, of course, if there is an alternative, if someone develops or innovates an alternative, that would be preferred. But this is not a scheme to prohibit or remove chemicals. That we have other legislations for that. But this is basically to help the market forces drive in the right direction, adding more transparency and giving greater agency I would say also to market actors.
Yeah, thank you. Maria, would you like to add something to this? I think it's a very important question when it comes to this process.
Absolutely. No, and I can only agree with Henrik. I think it's really important also to point out that this is not again negative requirements that are being imposed. These are like working in a positive direction. This is to incentivize development, R&D, and to incentivize better chemistry moving forward. So it's not about prohibiting yesterday's worst chemicals. I think it's also important to remember that what we're talking about is something that will be used for chemicals and materials. That's how it's been defined, and of course it will be the actual product of a chemical or a material, not the final article, but not also either not the it wouldn't be the constituents of a chemical product or material necessarily. So if we're talking about a polymer, it won't be like the monomers.
Great, thank you so much. I have another question for you, Maria, and that is, how did you verify if there are only safe chemicals in the end product?
How we do it today?
I guess they don't say that, but I guess how you do it today and how this process could be helpful if done correctly, I suppose. This is my interpretation of what's written here.
Okay. Well, today we secure our products in a number of ways, and we need these numbers away because, again, there is no clear connection back to chemical components. So what we basically need to do is, one, we have like input chemistry requirements. So that's where the manufacturing restricted substance list come in, for example, negative lists of what is not allowed in production. We also have a database system that picks up on substances used from the safety data sheets, but that requires, of course, good safety data sheets. But it allows us to identify the worst from there. We also have, of course, restrictions on product level. So that means that products actually need to be tested, but also that suppliers are not even allowed to use certain chemical products in the production of certain articles. So we have that. So it's kind of a massive system that we build up to secure this from every angle. But what we really need, and I think that's where we're so looking forward to this framework, is because we feel that this is a way to get that, get information without having to do all these steps. We'll still need to do a lot of it anyways, believe me, to assure everything. But this will be a more direct way for us to ask for safe chemicals instead of investigating ourselves, instead of always taking like ways around it and trying to come up with what's actually going into our products.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a question for Henrik. I know you've been in contact with many brands with a high level of chemicals management when talking about this concept and our interpretation and views on this. Can you maybe talk a bit about the general feedback you've had from these brands?
I think the general feedback is that this is something that seems very interesting to look into, but there's a level of complexity, and the process has not really been, I don't think that the topic has been discussed enough. So there's a great interest. And I also think that companies, as also Maria testifies here, that sees that there is a great potential in this if it's done right. So yeah, I would once again like to urge everyone that feels like this is something that actually could benefit your work and your company to engage.
Thank you. So I have a question here that I personally am very interested to hear the H&M Group view on, that is close to my heart. It says here, given the tendency of US suppliers to cite confidentiality to protect their products, especially in supply chain communication, how would the Safe Sustainable by Design be applied? And to clarify, that is not exclusively done by US suppliers. So Maria, that kind of links into what you said in your presentation about the importance of information.
Communication, yeah, and also that it really becomes a global framework. And I think that is, of course, a big risk with this being a European framework and being developed within the EU, that it will not reach the global status. But that's definitely, it would definitely be something we would work on to have as a global framework. We would, having this kind of framework just in the EU will open up for us to start asking for us also for this, also for from third country suppliers. So I think that's it will definitely open up that opportunity to discuss things, and maybe they can communicate their scorecard in a redacted fashion if they want to, but at least we would get details that we wouldn't have today.
Great. Thank you for clarifying so many questions. And we've also answered quite a few of them in the chat box, where you can find some elaborations on your questions. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and especially to Henrik and Maria for clarifying this quite complex area. And I hope many of you listening will engage. And if you have any further questions, you can always approach us with that later on. We will, as I said before, make this recording available online, and also the PowerPoint presentations. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you, and bye-bye.